Tonight we kick off a new feature here on The Big Picture, Conversations with Great Minds. My guest tonight is a man who has devoted his lifetime to political activism, is a pioneer in the grassroots democracy movement. He's an attorney, a lecturer, a four-time candidate for President of the United States, and author of numerous books, including his most recent, Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. My pleasure and honor to welcome Ralph Nader to our studio. Ralph,
thank you, Thom.
great to have you here with us. We're going to spend some time here tonight so we can dig into some of these topics with some substance. I'd like to start with your thoughts as a guy who has worked in the trenches of populism going back many decades to this new populist phenomena, or what is at least being sold to us as a populist phenomena, the Tea Party. Your thoughts on this?
Well, the Tea Party really can't be stereotyped. It's full of all kinds of views, from libertarian to advocates for a more ferocious plutocracy ruled by the wealthy. But if they call themselves populists, historically that means they're concerned with the distribution of power. And it's not just government power versus citizens. It's corporate power, it's labor power, it's whatever forms of power that they think are unfair. And I don't see it. I see primarily the manipulators of the Tea Partiers, and the Tea Partiers resist it, but they are being channeled in various ways. Dick Armey's group, for example, money that's going into their activities. They are, in effect, focusing on hating government, but not the corporate part of government, like the military budget, the corporate welfare, etc. They want to vector them to hate government when it's defined as Social Security, Medicare, and other services to the people.
You know, Franklin Roosevelt, back in 36, I think it was, in his acceptance speech in Philadelphia in July of 36, quoted he said, an old British judge once said, a necessitous man is not a free man. And I'd say for the better part of probably close to 200 years in the United States, we understood that there's a substrate on which freedom stands, on which we stand as free people. And that's, you know, the basic, the stuff that Teddy Roosevelt called the square deal, that Franklin Roosevelt called the New Deal, that Lyndon Johnson called the Great Society, that, I mean, literally George Washington had Congress appropriate money to care for the poor. And in fact, James Madison's first veto was saying, we're not going to run this through a church. This is the purpose of government. So there's this long history. And now these Tea Party conservatives, parroting the words of right-wing oil billionaires, basically, are saying, no, that's not freedom. That's the antithesis of freedom. And Glenn Beck and these guys. Freedom is the freedom to, and they don't quite fill in the blank. It's almost like, though, what they're saying is that freedom is the freedom to die in the gutter.
Well, you know, you speak from a long acquaintance with the history of corporate power and progressive movements. You've written a lot of books. There isn't a talk show person that knows more than you do about it. And I might point out that this point that you've been making has been raised by Abraham Lincoln, by Thomas Jefferson, by Teddy Roosevelt, by Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They all warned about concentrated corporate power. Well, Roosevelt in 1938, FDR sent a message to Congress, and he basically said, when government is controlled by private economic power, he said, quote, that's fascism. And he put a big F in front of it. That's 1938. Right. So,
and Henry Wallace went on in 42 in the New York Times, and a whole editorial about fascism in the United States.
What market fundamentalism does is it strips the American people of the principal countervailing power to multinational corporations, which is government.
Right.
And to look at government and then say we want to obey the Constitution and we like Lincoln's government of, by, for the people, the logic of that is that people should control the government so that it can bring to them what they cannot bring to themselves. And that's the purpose of government since Jefferson and Lincoln. And that means that there are certain community services beyond just police and fire and national defense that are brought back to the people as a result of their taxes going to their local, state, and national government. And that means the security net. That means what John Maynard Keynes said in the mid-1930s, a great economist from England. He said, hey, our Western economies have reached a level of productivity where we should solve the economic problem. And that means eliminate poverty.
Right.
Eliminate pay or die health insurance systems, eliminate child hunger, eliminate having to go 3 hours to a suburb to get a low-paying job in a rich person's home because there's no really good mass transit, and 3 hours back, getting up at 4 in the morning. And what needs to be conveyed in this country, which is accepted in Western Europe, is that there are two ways people get paid: salary for work, or wages for work, and community return based on what they put in through their taxes to build an economy.
Right.
And here's the rub, Tom. Name one modern burgeoning industry that wasn't launched by the taxpayer through research and development out of Washington. The biotech industry, half of the pharmaceutical industry, the containerization industry, the semiconductor computer industry, on and on. All this,
the internet.
The internet. All this came as a result of government research and development paid by the U.S. taxpayers through the Department of Defense, NASA, the National Institutes of Public Health, and given away free to these corporations, who then make it appear in their ads that they did all this.
Well, this has even been done by the drug companies now.
Yeah.
You know, most of their R&D money is actually coming through universities, through grants from the federal government.
Some years ago, I wrote a letter to the top 100 U.S. CEOs, and I said, why don't you get together and have a taxpayer appreciation day? Try April 15th. Just once. Say, thank you, American taxpayers, for bailing us out, subsidizing us, giving us the R&D that creates these new industries, and making all the profits and all the bonuses for the CEOs. Only one wrote back and thought it would be a fairly good idea, but most of them were not amused.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, in 1886, in his address, in his State of the Union address, Grover Cleveland, and this is following the Citizens United decision, he said there is now the iron heel of capital is upon the neck of the people. And, you know, this famous quote from Grover Cleveland, I mean, that was, you know, 130 years ago. We have this history, a long history in this country, literally going back to George Washington, but particularly to Jefferson's presidency, the third president, right up until, well, even Nixon, in some ways, pushed back on corporations. You know, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water, you participated in making a lot of that happen. But where has President Obama been? I mean, you know, it's a given that George Bush wasn't going to push back on him, and it's a given that. But where has President Obama been on that? It seems like he's just recently caught this. You know, as a result of Citizens United, he's out there talking about, you know, the Republican crazy train, basically, and the corporate power and influence. He called out Sam Alito. He called out the Supreme Court, and Sam Alito said, "You lie." And now it turns out it's obvious Sam Alito was lying. But, you know, what does that say about our politics today? I mean, you're looking at this with the long history, the perspective of the long history that you have, and how you've been pushing politics, you know, in progressive directions.
What it says is the giant corporations, through a number of levers, have crushed their opposition in the last 40 years. You're right, Nixon signed into law the Air and Water Pollution Act. He set up EPA, OSHA for job safety. Can you imagine any president doing that today?
No, it'd be called a socialist.
So here are the levers that these corporations use. Number one, they're financing both parties. And so the Democrats started about 1980 under Tony Coelho, the congressman, basically saying, you can raise big money, Democrats, from the corporations the way the Republicans. Number one lever. Number two, they crushed the labor movement through a variety of ways. The Democrats never stood up for labor reform, and repealing Taft-Hartley and all that. But then when globalization came, when WTO and NAFTA, GATT, and so on, they had a real threat. They could say, if you start a union in Arkansas, we're over the border in Mexico, we're going to China. So they crushed organized labor that way, which is very weak now and losing members, especially in the corporate sector. The third thing they did was they gamed the regulatory system. They developed a massive attack on regulation, said deregulation, and then they stripped, through their influence in Congress, the enforcement budgets. The corporate crime enforcement budget in the Justice Department is smaller number of lawyers than one big corporate firm out of dozens. There's nothing there. They can't keep up with it. And even though they know from their studies that $1 in corporate crime enforcement brings back $17 to the Treasury, like fighting Medicare fraud, on fraud. And then the final thing is they've gotten into universities. Very few professors are willing enough to stand up to the corporate octopus on the universities. The
Well,
funding.
a lot of them are taking money on the side.
Exactly.
I know these guys.
The moonlighting.
They get honorariums. They attend
Huge
$15,000 to give a
moonlighting,
speech.
joint ventures,
Yeah.
and so forth. So if you look at the major countervailing forces to corporate parties throughout American history, corporate power,
Yeah.
they have neutralized, gamed, destroyed, weakened almost all of them. The biggest victory was they blurred the two-party system and turned the Democrat and Republicans on corporate issues into one corporate party with two heads wearing different makeup.
Well, and to a large extent, wasn't that the consequence of their success in destroying the labor movement? I mean, when Clinton started his presidency, or when he started running for president, he and Tony Coelho and you know, all these, Rahm Emanuel, I mean, they put together the DLC because the unions had been destroyed. There wasn't money out there outside of the corporations.
Exactly.
You know, the hope of the Obama campaign was that it could be funded by the grassroots, that we can start something from the bottom up.
He did. He got it funded.
He did.
But he also set the all-time record of money from Wall Street and corporate law firms.
Yeah, well,
so he had a double header.
I don't think he's going to get that next time around. They're not real happy with him. But the question, I just read Chris Hedges' book last weekend, and it's just dreadfully dismal. I mean, he's essentially saying, it's over. Game's over. They won. You know, screw it. Let's go home.
That's the one that's
Let's go watch
called
football.
Death of Liberalism.
Yeah. And in fact, he blames liberals, you know, for not doing enough. And well, I shouldn't say that. I don't want to put words in Chris Hedges' mouth.
Well, he blames universities, the churches, the unions, the liberal elite.
So, are you ready to give up?
Yeah.
I'm not.
No.
I mean, I think that there's still a battle to be fought. I think it may be 4/5 gone, but we still have a little bit to hang on to that we can pull back.
It's simple. If I was speaking to a party of Tea Partiers, a whole auditorium, and Gingrich was speaking to them, I wouldn't bet on Gingrich.
Oh, yeah.
See? Because the Tea Party, they don't like Bush and Cheney either. Remember?
Yep.
They don't like what they did, the criminal wars of aggression that weren't declared unconstitutional. They didn't like the Patriot Act. They hate the Patriot Act. They don't like the corporate bailouts at Wall Street that Bush and Cheney started. So the idea is, what's shaping it are these massive talk show hosts, Glenn Beck, Limbaugh, every day.
Who are multimillionaires themselves.
Yeah, Limbaugh makes almost $1 million every 10 days.
Yeah.
And there isn't anybody on the other side, hardly. And certainly not with that reach, because on commercial radio and TV, corporations advertise, government doesn't. Right. So naturally, the talk show hosts that don't criticize corporations are going to get the advertisement, and they're going to get the audience.
Yeah, and we have just a minute here until the break, but it seems like the big point is that if you're going to have massive corporate power, there has to be a counterbalancing power, and that can only be government. And how do we communicate that to the American people? I mean, they knew it during
Well,
Roosevelt.
you start with their access to the courts. The other area that the corporations are beginning to seriously block are people, when they're injured and defrauded, access to the courts. You know, they call it tort reform, when it's really tort deform. All that malpractice injuries, toxic injuries, product defect injuries.
And then,
you notice, so what you do is you look at all the historic countervailing forces against corporate power, see how they have been weakened, see how they can be strengthened, and prepare for the counter.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Still to come, can billionaires save us? More with Ralph Nader in our Conversations with Great Minds series.